Rain poured down on the city like a heavy curtain, starting with a soft drizzle before turning into a downpour, drowning out all other sounds with the cold, relentless tapping of each drop. Shimmering puddles stretched across the streets, reflecting the pale yellow light of flickering lampposts that seemed to shiver in the early winter chill. Beneath the gray sky, a small boy pedaled his bicycle through the cascading water, his figure nearly swallowed by a soaked, flimsy hoodie. That was Jacob, 16 years old, with no parents, no relatives, and no one waiting for him at home, except for the peeling walls of an old orphanage tucked behind a damp industrial zone. Jacob had grown used to the rain, to the cold, to the gnawing hunger that kept him awake at night, while the wind whistled through the rotting window frame. Every afternoon after school, he would leave in a hurry, dodging the pitying eyes of his teachers, avoiding kind questions he didn't know how to answer without breaking down. He'd pack his books, change out of his school uniform into wrinkled old clothes, and pedal to a fast food joint on the corner, a place where he'd been working since he was 15, earning barely enough, but it was all he had. Food delivery wasn't for the weak. The rain soaked you to the bone, the sun scorched your skin, customers were impatient, the streets chaotic, and Jacob had to stay sharp because even the smallest mistake could cost him a meal or earn him a harsh scolding from his manager. Tonight, the rain was heavier than usual. His rusting bicycle groaned against the slick pavement, each turn of the wheel creaking like it too was exhausted. The backpack on Jacob's back had lightened. He had just completed his final delivery for the day. There was no tip, as usual, but at least he was done. Maybe, if luck was on his side, he'd get some leftover food like always. Every time he rode through a darkened street, he squinted against the glare of passing car headlights, rain needles stinging his face. But Jacob didn't stop. He never had, because if he fell, no one would be there to pick him up. At an age when most kids still long for protection, Jacob had already learned to be his anchor. His hands were numb with cold, fingers gripping the handlebars until they turned white, but he pushed on. He just needed to make it to the restaurant, pick up the food, then head to the familiar bus stop, the one with the broken bench and leaky shelter, the only place he could sit and eat a decent meal, even if it was leftovers. To most, a cold bag of fries or a dry burger was garbage. To Jacob, it was a gift, a rare hint of warmth in long, freezing days, and so, as the rain fell and the city pressed on in its vast, indifferent way, the journey of one lonely boy continued. His legs kept pedaling forward, quiet, steady, and unnoticed, unaware that tonight would mark the beginning of something extraordinary, something even he could never have imagined. The dim light spilling from the back door of Burger Fire flickered in the thick rain like the fragile glimmer of hope still lingering in Jacob's heart. He leaned his soaked bicycle against the moss-covered wall, gently pulled open the rusted door, and stepped inside. The warmth of the kitchen rushed toward him, but it wasn't enough to shake off the cold clinging to his thin frame. His clothes clung to his skin, water dripping steadily from his hair onto the chilly tiles. But Jacob didn't care. All he hoped for was that Mr. Quinn, the night manager, would toss him some leftover food, just like always. Mr. Quinn was a bald, heavy-set man with a permanent scowl, as if the world owed him something. To Jacob, he was the embodiment of cold practicality, a man who cared only about order numbers and shift hours, never once acknowledging that the boy in front of him was a struggling orphan trying to survive. When Jacob stepped in, Mr. Quinn didn't even look up. He shoved a crumpled paper bag into Jacob's hands and grunted, "Some leftover burger and fries? Take it. Don't say I never gave you anything." Jacob nodded quietly, his frozen hands trembling as he held the bag, not just from the cold, but from a quiet gratitude he couldn't voice. To him, each of these leftover meals wasn't just dinner. It was proof that he'd made it through another day without breaking. He turned around without a word and stepped back into the rain, holding the bag tight to his chest like it was treasure. He biked a short way to the familiar bus stop, the one with a half-missing roof, chipped concrete bench, and walls stained with moss. Sitting down, he shook the water from his jacket, placed the bag on his lap, and slowly opened it with trembling hands. The remaining warmth trapped in the paper made his stomach growl. Inside was a cheeseburger, slightly cold, and a handful of soggy fries. Worthless to others, but to Jacob, it was a simple dream. A small sign that maybe today hadn't been all bad. Just as he was about to take the first bite, a strange sound reached him. Faint, unclear, like a breath drawn through pain. A raspy groan, trembling, nearly drowned in the rhythm of rain on the metal roof. Jacob froze, eyes lifting. A strange unease tightened in his chest. He held his breath, listened. The sound came again, this time clearer, like the whisper of a lost soul. He sat still for a moment, then slowly stood, tucked the bag of food inside his jacket, and stepped into the rain, his shoes squelching in the puddles. Following the sound, he turned into a narrow alley beside the bus stop. The deeper he went, the stronger the stench of mold, garbage, and sewage filled his nose, forcing him to raise a hand to cover it. A flickering street lamp far away cast just enough light to reveal slick, dirty patches on the cement. He squinted, eyes fixed ahead, and then he saw it. A dog, large, soaked, curled up in the corner of the alley. Its matted fur was filthy, tangled with mud, and its belly was sunken so deeply that every rib jutted out beneath taut skin. Its ears were drooped, body trembling, eyes half-lidded, ready to give up. There was no aggression in its gaze, no plea, just the weary surrender of something long abandoned. Jacob stood motionless. In that moment, he saw himself. Another fragile creature the world had turned its back on. He had once curled up cold, hungry, and forgotten in some dark corner. A lump rose in his throat. Without hesitation, he knelt, opened the bag, and gently tore the burger in half. One half for him. The other he placed carefully in front of the dog, leaving space so it wouldn't feel threatened. At first, it didn't move, just stared at him with deep, tired eyes, then slowly stretched its neck to sniff. A second passed, then another, and suddenly it lunged forward, devouring the food like it hadn't eaten in days. Jacob watched in silence, his heart tightening. Though his stomach still growled, he didn't regret it. Something new stirred in him. Strange, warm, familiar, as if he'd just found a missing part of himself. He smiled, so faint even he didn't notice, and whispered, "I get it. When you're starving, nothing scares you anymore, huh?" And as if answering in kind, the dog lifted its head, licked its nose, and glanced at him. This time with eyes no longer empty, but filled with something deeply human. Gratitude. On a rainy night, in a forgotten alley of a heartless city, an orphan boy and a stray dog, both abandoned, both fighting to survive, had found each other, bound not by words but by half a burger and a heart still unbroken by hardship. From that moment on, an extraordinary journey quietly began. As the dog licked up the last crumbs of the burger, Jacob remained still, arms wrapped around his knees, eyes following the slow, tentative movements of the animal before him. His stomach was still growling like a drumbeat, yet he hadn't touched the other half of the burger, the portion he should have kept for himself on a day as cold, wet, and exhausting as this. But Jacob didn't. There was something in the dog's eyes that he couldn't ignore, something that kept him from turning away or pretending he hadn't seen it. The rain had eased now, down to a soft mist of fine droplets falling sparsely, veiling Jacob's soaked hair and gently dusting the matted fur of the stray dog. In that blurry haze, everything seemed to quiet down, and in the rare stillness of a noisy city, Jacob found a moment to breathe, slow and deep, as if trying to release all the numbness that had clung to him since morning. The rain could soak his clothes, could chill him to the bone, but it couldn't wash away the fragile feeling just beginning to grow inside him. A flicker of connection, just enough to make him feel that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't entirely alone. The dog lifted its head, licked its muzzle, then slowly scooted a little closer. It still trembled, still looked frail, but the fear in its eyes had faded. Now it was watching Jacob. Not with suspicion, but with growing curiosity, trying to understand who this boy was and why he'd shared something so precious. Jacob let out a faint smile, pale but warm, and slowly reached out his hand, careful not to startle the animal. He didn't touch it. He just placed his hand on the cold ground and said softly, "I don't have much, but if you need it, I'll share." The dog stared at him, ears twitching slightly, then inched forward just a bit, like it was testing the idea of trust. Jacob kept speaking, his voice quiet, like confiding in an old friend. "You were abandoned too, right? No one to care, no one to come looking. Just like me." He leaned back against the damp wall, his gaze softening as the memory of his grandmother came to him. How she used to hold his hand on rainy nights like this, tell him stories, and promise that the world wasn't all cold. But then she left, too soon, too suddenly, leaving him alone with a life too big and too empty. He looked at the dog again, not taking his eyes off its muddy, soaked face, so raw and real in its sadness. Jacob had never imagined bonding with an animal, but right then, as the dog gently rested its head beside his leg, he knew a connection had been made, not over food, but over a shared, unspoken understanding. After a long while, as the rain all but stopped, Jacob sighed and murmured, "You can't just be the dog forever. You need a name." His eyes scanned the alley, finally settling on the long shadow the dog cast on the ground, blending quietly into the darkness like it had always been there, silently following. And then he smiled, a small, certain smile, as if he'd found something simple but right. "Shadow. I'll call you Shadow." The dog, or rather, Shadow, tilted its head slightly, almost in response, then lifted a front paw and edged even closer. Jacob felt the trust taking root, needing no conditions. He pulled out the other half of the burger from the paper bag, broke it again, and placed another piece in front of Shadow, keeping the rest in his hand, though he still didn't eat. "Shadow, you know," Jacob said, watching the dog eat with more calm now. "I've never really had anyone. Since my grandma passed, I've had to handle everything alone. But today, I found you. And weirdly, I don't feel so alone anymore." It was late. The sky had turned a deep velvet black. No stars, no moon, only a chill wind slipping through narrow city alleys. Jacob pulled his thin jacket tighter around himself, stood slowly, took a few steps out of the alley, then turned back to look. Shadow was now curled up, head resting on his paws, eyes half closed in a sleep born of exhaustion. Jacob didn't want to leave, but he knew if he didn't return to the orphanage before curfew, the consequences would be harsh. Miss Agnes, the strict director, never cut slack to any child. To her, Jacob was the troublesome one, always late, always shabby, and always with that look in his eyes that makes people uncomfortable. He turned away, his heart heavy. But after just a few steps, he paused, pulled off the hoodie he was wearing, went back, and gently laid it over Shadow like a makeshift blanket. A small gesture, but one filled with a tenderness the world had never shown him. "Sleep well, Shadow. I'll come back," he whispered. And just like that, on a night when the rain had finally stopped, in an alley hidden from light and from anyone's concern, a strange friendship quietly began. Not built with words, but with empathy, with half a meal, a name, and a shared look that said, "I see you." A boy and a stray, two shadows in the dark, had found each other in a world they both thought had forgotten them. That night, lying on the cold metal bed at the orphanage, Jacob couldn't sleep. The thin blanket was pulled to his chin, and the rain outside the window had long stopped. But his mind kept circling back to the image of the skinny dog sleeping under his hoodie, the quiet, closed-off creature that had somehow opened his heart for the first time in years. He didn't quite understand why he was thinking about it so much. All he knew was that ever since he called it Shadow, something had shifted. Not loud or obvious, but deep and steady, like the first rains of the season. The next morning, Jacob tried to hide his exhaustion from the sharp eyes of Miss Agnes, the head of the orphanage, who immediately noticed his favorite hoodie was missing. She didn't ask many questions, just scribbled a red line in his record, as if he had committed some unpardonable sin. In her eyes, Jacob was nothing more than a problem to be managed, a boy too quiet to love, yet too difficult to ignore. After school, Jacob rushed out of class as usual, but this time there was a strange kind of anticipation tightening in his chest. He pedaled faster than usual, ignoring the hunger, ignoring the fatigue, just wanting to get back to the narrow alley beside the bus stop, the place he had left the night before, where Shadow had curled up under his damp hoodie. When he arrived, he jumped off his bike and ran into the alley, eyes scanning every wall, every puddle, every pocket of Shadow. But Shadow was gone. Only the damp wall remained, a few crumbs left behind, and a faint trace of fur. So faint it was almost invisible. Everything was still, as if Shadow had been nothing more than a brief dream that had quietly faded with the sunrise. Jacob's chest tightened. He wasn't sure if it was disappointment or something closer to fear. He crouched down, looked again, hoping for a miracle, but the only response was the cold wind cutting through the alley and the distant rumble of traffic. He pulled out his phone to check the time. His shift was about to start, and he couldn't afford to be late. Rising to his feet, he slung on his backpack, wheeled his bike around, and started down the familiar road again, the feeling of loss still lingering like a weight in his chest. But as he neared the fast food restaurant, weaving through the crowded street and the neon glow of the buildings, Jacob felt something was off, something subtle, like eyes watching him from afar. Not threatening, but not quite unseen either. He glanced over his shoulder, but there was nothing. Just a long street and a few passers-by. Shaking his head, he brushed the feeling off, parked his bike by the familiar wall, and stepped inside to begin another long shift. Inside, Mr. Quinn was already waiting, arms crossed, eyes full of suspicion. He glanced at his watch, then at Jacob's wrinkled shirt, scoffed, and said flatly, "3 minutes late. Next time, I'm not docking your hours. I'm firing you." Jacob nodded without a word. He knew arguing was pointless. To Mr. Quinn, he was just cheap labor. Easy to command, easy to replace, easy to forget. The shift passed in its usual silence, orders flying in, customers in a rush, and the stifling smell of oil clinging to his sweat. By the time it ended, the air had grown chilly again. Jacob slung on his backpack and headed out the back door. And then, just beneath the dim yellow light that didn't quite reach the far wall, he saw it. A familiar shape, sitting still in the shadows. His heart skipped, and his breath caught in his throat. He stepped closer, and there it was. Those eyes, that look, the matted fur, it was Shadow. The dog didn't bark or run up. It simply sat there in silence as if it had never left. Its eyes followed him like a loyal shadow, a silent friend. Jacob stood frozen for a moment, then slowly walked over, crouched down, and asked in a trembling voice, "You followed me?" Shadow didn't answer, of course, but it tilted its head, wagged its tail once, then stilled again, as if saying, "Yeah, I've been here the whole time." A smile broke across Jacob's soot-smudged face. Surprised, relieved, like a lost part of himself had just returned. "So you found me after all," he whispered, sitting beside Shadow, his hand gently stroking the damp fur. "I thought you were gone." In this noisy city, no one watched Jacob's steps. No one noticed when he left or returned. No one waited for him after a long shift, except Shadow. And in that quiet moment, beneath the dull streetlights and the rush of passing cars, Jacob knew he was no longer invisible. Somewhere in this world, a creature had chosen to follow him. Quietly, loyally, with no explanation needed. And though no one else would ever know, he had just found something he'd been searching for all these years. A friend, or more precisely, a shadow that would never leave. Since that night, when Jacob sat beside the silent, loyal figure of a dog in the shadowed corner of the restaurant wall, something in him had quietly changed. The loneliness that had haunted him through the years at the orphanage began to ease, softened by the constant presence of a creature that spoke no words, but somehow understood him better than anyone ever had. From then on, every morning still began the same. The cold voice of Miss Agnes cutting through his sleep, the bland breakfast, the sharp stares from the other kids. But Jacob held on to one quiet truth, that if he made it through school and another grueling shift, he'd find those familiar brown eyes waiting for him at the end of the road, the deep, steady gaze of Shadow. From that day, Shadow began to follow Jacob, never drawing attention, never making a sound, always keeping just close enough not to lose sight, but far enough to avoid being seen. Every time Jacob looked back during a delivery, he'd catch a glimpse of that familiar figure lurking behind a tree, beside a trash bin, or sitting beneath an awning across the street, head tilted, quietly watching. At first, Jacob wasn't sure whether to let Shadow follow. He worried about its safety, about someone calling animal control, or worse, Miss Agnes finding out and scribbling more angry red ink across his fragile record. But the comfort Shadow gave outweighed every fear. Jacob began to adjust to this quiet shadow in his life, sharing half his sandwich during lunch breaks, sneaking scraps of meat into his pocket after work, and every night after his shift at Burger Fire, taking the familiar detour down the alley where Shadow always waited, like something essential woven into his routine. On nights when sudden rain poured down, Jacob would take shelter beneath the crumbling awning of an old laundromat, hugging his backpack tight, with Shadow curled beside him, its back pressed against his leg. Under the rain, amid the distant blare of car horns, Jacob would gently run his hand down its spine and whisper the name again. Shadow, not as a passing nickname, but as a promise. The name of a real friend. Once, Kyle, an older co-worker at Burger Fire, caught Jacob sitting in the lot with Shadow and didn't miss a chance to mock him in front of everyone. Well, look who finally found a friend. What, bringing a stray mutt to work now? Trash sticks with trash, I guess. The quiet laughter behind him made Jacob's face burn. But he said nothing. He just held Shadow close, shielding it from the cruelty in their eyes. He knew that in people like Kyle, he'd always be something beneath notice. No family, no money, no voice. But in Shadow's eyes, he wasn't worthless. And that was enough to get through the rest. Day by day, their bond grew stronger. Not through words or lessons, but through presence and unspoken trust. Jacob began talking to Shadow as if it understood everything, venting about rude customers, sharing his dream of learning to draw somewhere he wouldn't be laughed at for his shaky lines, even recalling broken pieces of memory about his grandmother, the only person who ever said his name with softness. Shadow always listened. Its eyes lit up every time Jacob said its name. Its tail would flick, as if saying, "I'm still here." One evening, the wind picked up, and Jacob pedaled to Burger Fire through biting cold. When he emerged later, there was Shadow, soaked, shivering, but still waiting. Jacob pulled out the leftovers, split the cold sandwich in half, and sat down with Shadow under the dull streetlight. They shared dinner like they had 100 times, and Jacob said softly, like a vow, "From now on, you're not just a stray. You're Shadow, and you're my friend." Shadow licked his hand, eyes shining with something Jacob couldn't name. But he knew what it meant. A bond that couldn't be broken. From that moment on, Shadow wasn't just a name. It became a symbol of everything Jacob believed in. Loyalty, friendship, and hope. The kind he once thought he'd lost forever. Somewhere in the cracks of this enormous, indifferent world. Life was still hard. The rain still fell. The hunger still returned. The stares were still sharp. But now Jacob was no longer alone. He had Shadow. And in both their hearts, the presence of the other was the one thing that would never be lost. From that night on, every time Jacob stepped out after his shift, he would find Shadow waiting in the dark corner near the restaurant wall, eyes lighting up, never demanding, never expecting, just quietly waiting. Like Jacob, Shadow had nowhere to go, no one to call family, and that shared emptiness wove an invisible bond between them, stronger and stranger than Jacob had ever known. Maybe that's why, on a freezing weekend night, when Jacob rummaged through his pockets and found only a few coins and a crumpled bus ticket, he still didn't hesitate to step back into the restaurant and buy a small box of grilled chicken, the only thing Shadow could eat without getting sick from strong seasoning. Standing at the counter, Jacob could feel Kyle's glare burning into his back. Kyle, who never missed a chance to nitpick everything Jacob did, from wiping counters the wrong way to late deliveries caused by torrential rain. He wasn't just a senior staff member at BurgerFire. He also saw himself as the rightful manager, better than that bald idiot Quinn who only knows how to yell. And so, for kids like Jacob, quiet, poor, never one to argue, Kyle made sure every day was a reminder of how little they mattered. Jacob carried the box of chicken outside, shielding it from the cold under his jacket, and walked toward Shadow, who was sitting patiently beneath the worn iron bench. He sat down, opened the container, tore the chicken into small pieces, and placed them carefully in his palm. Shadow didn't lunge like that first night. Instead, he lowered his head gently, sniffed, then began eating slowly, like he understood that each bite was a silent sacrifice from Jacob, something hard-earned and freely given. That quiet scene might have passed unnoticed, if not for the voice that suddenly tore through it. "Jacob, what the hell do you think you're doing out here?" It was Mr. Quinn, storming out the back door, his eyes blazing. Jacob shot to his feet, startled, nearly dropping the box. Shadow instantly stepped back, ears raised, eyes fixed cautiously on the man. Quinn marched up, face red with anger, and stopped right in front of Jacob, spitting out his words. "You spent your wages feeding a stray dog? Are you kidding me?" Jacob held his ground, voice calm but firm. "It's my money, and he's my friend." The moment froze. Quinn scoffed, half laugh, half threat, and stepped even closer. "Friend? That's why you've been late for 3 nights straight? You think I don't know? Out here every night wasting time with that thing instead of getting inside on time. This is a restaurant, Jacob, not an animal shelter. I need workers, not dreamers, not some kid playing hero." Jacob's chest rose and fell. His hands clenched the now cold box of chicken. He could feel the weight of the moment. He could have apologized, promised to stop, offered excuses. Maybe then Quinn would have let it slide. But Jacob couldn't, because the one thing he still had, his kindness, was the last good thing the world hadn't stripped from him. And he wouldn't let anyone take that, too. "I'm not sorry," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it was steady, clear like a river cutting through a storm. "I know what's right." Quinn glared, exhaled sharply, and snapped, "One more time, just once, and you're gone. Got it?" Without waiting for a reply, he turned and disappeared back inside, the heavy metal door slamming shut behind him with a cold, final thud. Jacob stood there for a moment, heart still pounding in his chest. He looked over at Shadow and smiled, not because he was happy, but because he knew he'd stayed true to himself. And in a world like this, that was something to be proud of. He sat down again, handed the remaining chicken to Shadow, and whispered, "It's okay. I'll always share what I have, even if I've got nothing left." And so, in a city full of people but starved of compassion, in the space between harsh commands and quiet, unconditional loyalty, Jacob chose kindness, not because he was naive, but because he knew that losing it would mean losing the last piece of himself that still believed in good. And Shadow, with those unwavering eyes, seemed to understand that better than anyone. Since that night, despite warnings and threats of being fired, Jacob continued to share his food with Shadow at the end of every shift. To him, watching the dog wag its tail and look up at him with gentle eyes as it accepted each bite was one of the few moments that made him feel like he still had value in this cold, indifferent world. But as life often proves, Anything beautiful that Jacob held onto was always at risk of being taken away, threatened by the cruelty of those who neither understood nor cared for what true kindness meant. That evening, the sky was dry, but the wind howled through the narrow alleys. Jacob had just completed his last delivery, sweat dotting his forehead despite the biting cold. He pedaled toward the familiar alley behind the old bakery, where Shadow had recently taken to waiting for him. But tonight, instead of seeing the quiet, gentle figure wagging its tail in greeting, Jacob heard an unsettling sound. Mocking laughter mixed with frantic, helpless barking. A sinking feeling gripped his chest. Without hesitation, Jacob abandoned his bike and sprinted toward the noise. The sight that met him made his heart clench. 3 teenagers, around 17 or 18, dressed in flashy clothes, had cornered Shadow against the wall. The dog lay pressed against the ground, ears flattened, body trembling. The largest of the group, a boy with bright red-dyed hair, held an empty plastic water bottle, slamming it repeatedly against the pavement near Shadow's head, as if it were some twisted joke. The other 2 laughed cruelly, kicking the wall beside the terrified dog, making it flinch with nowhere to escape. "Hey, look how scared it is! Ha ha ha! Filthy stray! Probably waiting for its trash owner to come pick it up!" The red-haired boy sneered, his eyes filled with disdain. Jacob didn't think. He simply acted. He lunged forward, shouting, "Stop! Don't hurt him!" His voice cracked with fury and fear, echoing through the narrow alley. The group turned, momentarily surprised to see a skinny delivery boy in a worn-out uniform, chest heaving, fists clenched. The red-haired boy smirked. "Oh, look who showed up. The stray's pathetic owner. What are you gonna do, huh? Call animal rescue." Jacob didn't respond. Instead, he stepped forward and positioned himself in front of Shadow, arms outstretched, as if his small frame alone could shield the trembling creature behind him. "He hasn't done anything to you. Just leave him alone." His voice wavered, but his eyes burned with determination. A rare defiance in someone who had spent his life bowing to forces greater than himself. "How adorable," one of the other boys laughed, before suddenly shoving Jacob hard. He stumbled backward, crashing against the cold pavement, his hips slamming into the brick wall with sharp pain. The laughter grew louder. Then, in that instant, a fierce growl cut through the air, a sound Jacob had never heard from Shadow before. No longer curled up in fear, the dog had risen. Its fur bristled, its teeth bared in a snarl, a deep, guttural warning echoing from its throat. Then, in one swift motion, Shadow lunged forward, standing protectively in front of Jacob. Its brown eyes blazed with an intensity that sent a shiver through the group. "The hell? Is it gonna bite?" The red-haired boy hesitated, his smirk vanishing as he took an instinctive step back. One of the others moved forward, but Shadow barked, a sharp, commanding sound that shattered whatever cruel amusement they had left. The group faltered. A beat of silence passed. Then, muttering curses under their breath, they turned and fled, their hurried footsteps disappearing into the darkness of the city. Jacob pushed himself upright, wincing at the pain but ignoring it. Instead, he wrapped his arms around Shadow, burying his face in the dog's damp fur. "Thank you, I'm okay now. You saved me." Shadow licked his hand gently, tail wagging just slightly. And at that moment, they both understood. No matter how ruthless the world was, as long as they had each other, they could find the strength to rise after every fall. And in that moment, Jacob no longer saw Shadow as just a stray dog. He was a friend, a companion willing to protect him, no matter the cost, whether it be pain, blood, or even life itself. A bond unspoken, yet the most real and unconditional connection Jacob had ever known. Deep, unwavering, and irreplaceable. Jacob sat on the freezing concrete, clutching Shadow's battered body. The darkness closed in around them, leaving only the rustling leaves in the wind and the distant hum of passing cars. His hip still ached, and his hands were scraped and bleeding from the fall, but those wounds seemed insignificant compared to the tightness in his chest. The unbearable weight of seeing Shadow, his only friend, cornered, trembling, and helpless against those who found joy in crushing the weak. The image replayed in his mind, relentless, suffocating, filling him with the bitter guilt of having failed Shadow by not arriving in time to protect him. Carefully, Jacob unzipped his worn-out backpack and pulled out an old washcloth, frayed at the edges, barely enough for his morning routine. But now, it was all he had to tend to Shadow's wounds. With slow, deliberate movements, he began wiping away the dirt and grime clinging to the dog's thick, matted fur, gently dabbing at the raw, bloody scrapes where Shadow had been kicked and dragged across the pavement. Each time Shadow flinched, Jacob stopped, whispering, "I'm sorry," as if soothing a frightened child. His hands trembled, not from the cold, but from helplessness, from heartbreak. For the first time in his life, he wanted to cry, not for himself, but for the one creature that had given him an unshakable loyalty he had never received from anyone else. The night deepened, and the air turned even colder, seeping through Jacob's thin clothes, slipping into the space between his back and the wall. But he didn't leave. Instead, he pulled Shadow closer, letting their shared warmth shield them from the unforgiving night. Shadow's eyes grew heavy, his cold nose pressed against Jacob's palm, his ears drooping but no longer shaking with fear. It was then that Jacob realized, through Shadow's eyes, that he wasn't just an orphan nobody wanted, not just a lowly delivery boy or a burden to the orphanage. To Shadow, he was a friend, the only anchor in a chaotic world. "Shadow," Jacob whispered, his voice nearly breaking with emotion. "Did you know I used to think I didn't belong anywhere? That place, the orphanage, it wasn't a home. The people there fed me, gave me a bed, but they never saw me as a child who needed love. I work because I need money, not because anyone is waiting for me to come home. I go to school because they make me, not because anyone believes I'll ever amount to anything. I exist like a shadow." He paused, tilting his head back to stare at the murky sky, where thick clouds drifted, swallowing any trace of the stars. Then, he looked down again, meeting Shadow's deep brown eyes, unchanged from the first day he had found him in that freezing alley. "But you," Jacob murmured, "you see me differently. You don't need me to be smart or rich or anything at all. You just need me to be here, and I don't need anything except you." Shadow let out a quiet whimper, then lifted his head to lick Jacob's hand, as if sealing an unspoken promise. Jacob chuckled, soft, exhausted yet inexplicably warm, then curled up against the wall, wrapping his arms around Shadow as if holding on to the most precious treasure he had ever found. At that moment, he didn't think about Mr. Quinn's cold glares or the threats of losing his job. He didn't think about the lonely meals at the orphanage or the years of silent isolation. He thought only of one thing. He was no longer alone. The name Shadow was no longer just a label. It was a testament to a bond that transcended the line between human and animal. It was the name of the one soul who had stayed when the rest of the world turned away. And from that night on, Jacob no longer believed he was without a family. His family, though small and without a home in the traditional sense, was warmer than any shelter he had ever known. It was a place where an orphaned boy and a stray dog, two lost souls, could lean on each other to live, to grow, and to believe that, one day, things would get better. As the first light of dawn crept in, the dim glow of streetlights faded, giving way to the pale morning sun filtering through a thin veil of mist. Only then did Jacob quietly leave the alley, where he and Shadow had spent the longest night he could remember. He walked his bike slowly, pedaling toward the orphanage with Shadow trotting beside him like a faithful shadow. They didn't speak, but if silence could be called something, it was the only warmth left in Jacob's life before stepping through the cold iron gates that had caged his childhood for nearly 10 years. St. James Orphanage was an old building tucked behind a row of apartment blocks, its walls streaked with peeling paint its windows cracked and clouded with dust, and its front yard overgrown with weeds. To outsiders, it was a home for unwanted children. But to Jacob and many others, it was just a pretty name for a place that raised souls slowly turning to stone. Among those who lived there, 3 faces stood out in Jacob's daily life, each playing a role, each keeping a certain distance within his heart. Mason was Jacob's roommate, a 15-year-old boy, small for his age, quick-witted but carrying eyes far too sorrowful for someone so young. Unlike Jacob, who chose silence, Mason was always looking for ways to make life feel a little less heavy, hiding books from the older kids, making up ridiculous parody songs just to make the cook laugh. But beneath his playful facade lay a fragile heart. There were nights when Mason would wake up from nightmares, clutching an old cloth that still carried the faint scent of his mother. Jacob never asked questions. He simply turned on the bedside lamp, letting the soft light chase away some of the nameless fears. The only person in the orphanage who made Jacob feel somewhat at ease, if not slightly grateful, was Miss Ellie, the soul cook, a middle-aged woman who always wore a floral apron, her voice as gentle as the scent of freshly baked bread drifting from the kitchen each morning. She never spoke much, never acted overly familiar, but she always made sure Jacob's slice of bread was slightly thicker when he returned late from his night shifts. Once, when he had a fever, it was Miss Ellie who quietly left a cup of ginger tea beside his bed, with nothing but a small handwritten note. "Rest up. Tomorrow will be better." Those small acts meant more to Jacob than any words of comfort ever could. But then, there was one name that always made him shrink back whenever it was mentioned. Mrs. Agnes, the director of the orphanage. A strict woman, her hair always pinned up so tightly it seemed she had never let it down, her eyes sharp, and her lips perpetually pressed into a thin line as if softness was an unforgivable sin. To her, discipline was absolute, and any child who broke the rules, even by being 5 minutes late, was written up, punished with extra chores, or sent to confinement. Jacob had never seen her smile, nor had he ever heard her say his name with the warmth adults used for children. To her, he was simply that troublesome boy, the one who doesn't respect rules, the kind that won't amount to anything unless he learns obedience. During internal meetings, Mrs. Agnes would stand on the wooden platform in the main hall, arms crossed, reading the rulebook as if it were a court verdict. Sometimes her gaze would land directly on Jacob, not because he had done anything wrong, but because his very presence seemed to annoy her. Perhaps, in her eyes, orphans who deserved help were the ones who stayed quiet, who followed orders without question. Not boys like Jacob, who worked outside, who dared to protect a stray dog, who carried a resilience she could not control. That was why, every time he returned to the orphanage, Jacob would secretly lead Shadow around the back gate, hiding him in an abandoned storage shed near the bike racks, a place where he had laid out an old rug and kept a small bowl of water. Each time he left, he would whisper, "Stay quiet. No one can find you." Because he knew, if Shadow was discovered even once, Mrs. Agnes would not hesitate to throw him out. And this time there would be no pleading for one more night. Jacob lived among these faces, Mason, innocent but fragile, Miss Ellie, kind but unable to protect, and Mrs. Agnes, the cold embodiment of order. And he understood one thing. In this place called a home, nothing was ever truly safe, except for Shadow, the only one he trusted completely. The first family he had ever chosen, not because it was assigned to him, but because, in the cruelty of the world, they had found each other. For weeks after the night Shadow was attacked by the group of teenagers, Jacob continued his quiet life as if nothing had changed. He still rode his bike to work after school, still saved part of his meal to bring back to the old storage shed behind the orphanage, where Shadow hid like a small but sacred secret he kept to himself. Every evening after his shift, Jacob would quietly push open the rusty iron door, slipping inside with a small flashlight in hand, sitting beside Shadow and whispering about his day. The customers' complaints? A new dish at Burger Fire? Or simply the joy of watching Mason laugh loudly when he won candy at lunch? In the closed and suffocating world of St. James Orphanage, Jacob had found a tiny space to breathe. The only thing that made him feel like he was still just a boy was sitting beside Shadow, knowing that at least one living soul in the world needed him. But no world, no matter how carefully hidden, could escape the sharp watch of Mrs. Agnes. It happened on a Saturday afternoon after lunch. Jacob had gone to the shed to clean up Shadow's sleeping spot. The old blanket had gotten soaked from the rain the night before, and he was replacing it with a tarp he had gotten from the bakery near school. He didn't expect that. Just as he crouched down to stroke Shadow's back, the door behind him would suddenly swing open with a creak, cold and ominous, like the knock of fate itself. Jacob spun around, and his heart clenched at the sight of the tall, slender figure, hair tightly pinned up, eyes so sharp they could cut through the dust-filled sunlight. Mrs. Agnes stood there, silent, her gaze slicing through him like a blade. A suffocating silence filled the room. "What exactly am I looking at, Jacob?" Her voice was calm, low, but weighted like a heavy stone. Jacob froze. He knew there was no explanation that would convince her. Not when she believed that emotions were a weakness that disrupted order. "This is an orphanage, not a shelter for strays," she continued, her voice tightening, eyes burning with the kind of anger that made Jacob feel as if he had defiled something sacred in her perfectly structured world. "How long have you been hiding this filth here? How many days have you lied to me?" "Shadow has nowhere else to go," Jacob said, trying to steady his voice, though it trembled as he stepped protectively in front of the dog, gripping the tarp in his hands. "He's good. He doesn't hurt anyone. He just needs a place to sleep. That's not my problem." Her words cut like ice. "Rules are rules. You live here, you follow them. If you want to keep that dog, then you and it can leave. Right now." The sentence struck like a death sentence. Jacob stood frozen, his eyes darting between her cold fury and Shadow's confused gaze, the dog whining softly, unable to understand the words, but sensing the tension in Jacob's rigid body. Jacob took a deep breath, his hands loosening at his sides, his heart suddenly empty. The choice was clear, and though it hurt, he had never once doubted what he would do. Because if he had to choose between a place that called itself a home, but had no room for kindness and a creature who had licked his hand when he cried alone in the dark, then he knew, without hesitation, where he truly belonged. "I choose Shadow," he said. He didn't shout. He didn't beg. He simply spoke the truth, accepting it as it was, even as the cold hallway wind crept through the thin fabric of his jacket. For a fleeting second, Mrs. Agnes's eyes flickered, almost as if she couldn't believe a child would give up food, shelter, protection for a dog. But then she turned away, lifting a hand to point toward the door. No more words were needed. Her decision had been made. Jacob bent down, gently stroked Shadow's head, then slung his backpack over his shoulder, pulling the edge of his jacket over the crumbs of bread and water bottle he'd stashed away at noon. He didn't look back. Not at Mason, who had just appeared at the end of the hallway with a stunned expression, and not at the room he had slept in for so many years. He simply gripped the makeshift leash, a worn piece of rope, led Shadow beside him, and stepped through the iron gate left slightly ajar, out into the night that had already fallen, cold and sharp like the decision he had just made. And just like that, Jacob, once again a boy with no parents, no one waiting for him, became homeless. But this time he wasn't walking alone. Beside him was a pair of eyes that never stopped watching, a pair of ears that always listened, and a heart loyal without condition. In the wind that cut through the streets as his silhouette faded down the block, no one would remember that a boy named Jacob had ever lived at St. James. But Jacob would remember. He would remember vividly that on the night he was cast out of the place once called home, he carried with him the only things that truly mattered: a heart, a shadow, a family, named Shadow. The night wind lashed against his face, cutting through the thin layers of his clothes, carrying the biting chill of a winter not yet at its peak, but already sharp enough to sting. Jacob pulled his collar tighter, his steps heavy as he trudged along the deserted sidewalk. Shadow walked silently beside him. Not running, not barking, only occasionally licking Jacob's clenched hand. A quiet reminder. "I'm here. Don't be afraid." They crossed narrow streets, where the dim yellow glow of streetlights cast long, wavering shadows. Two small figures drifting through a world that paid them no mind. No one asked why a boy was wandering the streets at night with a dog by his side. No one stopped their car to ask if he needed help. In this vast city, coldness was not just in the air. It was in people's eyes. Jacob didn't know where he was going. He only knew he couldn't go back to the orphanage, couldn't sleep on the sidewalk near Burger Fire for fear of being seen, and the old storage shed was no longer safe. Every place he had once considered familiar was now closed off to him, cold and unfeeling. Just like Mrs. Agnes's final words, "You and that dog, get out." With every step, his mind echoed with the wind howling between the orphanage walls, the image of Mason standing frozen at the second-floor window, too shocked to say anything, only able to watch him leave, like a fleeting gust of dust in the night. And then, as if by instinct, when every door had shut him out, Jacob's thoughts returned to the only place that had ever truly felt safe, the arms of his grandmother. As a child, whenever the wind howled, she would pull a thick blanket over his shoulders and whisper fairy tales. Simple stories, but warm in a way nothing else in the world was. Her voice was soft and low, her gaze always filled with a gentleness that no one else ever seemed willing to offer a boy like him. Jacob remembered those rainy nights when she would make him a warm cup of milk, carefully wrap a scarf around his neck and say, "No matter how cold it is outside, as long as your heart stays warm, you will always find your way home." When she passed away, that sentence was the only thing left in his memory whenever he felt lost. And now, under a moonless sky, with the wind biting his skin and his stomach hollow with hunger, Jacob closed his eyes for a moment, imagining her frail hands resting on his shoulders once more. He turned to Shadow, running a hand over the dog's matted fur, damp with night mist, and whispered, more to the past than to the present, "Grandma, I'm okay. I have Shadow now. You don't have to worry anymore." They kept walking, past closed diners, darkened grocery stores, and empty lots where no one cared about the presence of a 16-year-old boy and his starving dog. Jacob had always thought he knew loneliness, but tonight, when there was nowhere to return to, no bed, no blanket, no one waiting, he finally understood what it meant to be truly cast out, left with nothing but himself and a creature who couldn't speak, yet heard everything he couldn't say. At last, when his legs ached and his eyes stung from wind and exhaustion, Jacob spotted a small park at the end of the street. No lights, no people, only bare trees and a single stone bench hidden behind a patch of wildflowers. He led Shadow inside, spread his only jacket on the cold ground, and sat down, leaning against the trunk of a tree, pulling the dog close. Shadow curled up against him, burying its head into his chest, its warm breath the only thing that reminded Jacob he was still here, still real. And in that vast, silent darkness, as the world slept, Jacob tilted his head back, gazing at the empty sky where only heavy clouds drifted, then closed his eyes. His voice was barely a whisper, just loud enough for Shadow to hear. "We won't stop until we find a place that truly feels like home." By dawn, the cold wind still hadn't let up, slicing through Jacob's thin clothes, settling not just in his skin but deep in his bones. After a sleepless night, he trudged wearily through a maze of narrow alleys, Shadow at his side, his eyes scanning for any kind of shelter, a place where they could sit down and just breathe. Every time Shadow whimpered from aching paws, Jacob would pause to stroke his back and whisper silently in his mind, "Just a little farther. We'll find somewhere soon." A faint memory lit the way. Months ago, during a delivery, Jacob had once gotten lost in an old industrial zone, where an abandoned bus stop lay tucked behind a rusted fence, forgotten since the last route had shut down. He remembered it being dark and dusty, but windproof, enough to shield them from the biting gusts that had scraped his face like razor blades all night long. He turned down a side street, weaved between tall concrete walls and piles of collapsed cardboard boxes, and finally arrived at the spot, a peeling metal awning above a broken signpost, the remnants of a bus stop now faded to silence. There were no lights, no route numbers, nothing left to recall the people who once came and went. Just a space, abandoned and overlooked, and perhaps that made it perfect. For two souls the world had forgotten too. Jacob ducked under the shelter, his footsteps crunching over dried leaves, sharp and crisp in the morning stillness. Inside there was a wooden bench, broken on one end, and a dusty concrete floor stained with moisture. The tin roof had holes here and there, but most of the wind stayed out. He dropped his backpack, brushed off a spot on the floor, and softly called Shadow over, guiding him into the driest corner, close enough to watch both the entrance and the street beyond. Watching Shadow curl up tightly, Jacob bit his lip, then shrugged off the only jacket he had. Thin and frayed after years of wear, it held little warmth, but still, he wrapped it around the dog's bony back with trembling hands. It was a reflex, instinctive to those who know what it's like to have nothing. Shadow didn't resist. He lifted his head and looked at Jacob, his brown eyes dulled by exhaustion, but still flickering with a loyalty that couldn't be spoken. Jacob stroked him gently, then sat down against the wall, exhaling a long breath, as if, finally, he could pause for a moment after hours of wandering without purpose. From his backpack, Jacob pulled out the last piece of bread, dry, hardened from 2 days ago, saved for moments just like this. It wasn't much, but it was all they had. Without hesitation, he broke it in half, offering one piece to Shadow and keeping the other for himself. "I'm not that hungry anyway," he murmured, trying to soothe the dog, even though his stomach, rumbling quietly, betrayed the lie. Shadow sniffed the bread, then licked Jacob's hand instead of eating right away, as if to say he understood how much this small act of sharing meant. Finally, he nibbled on it slowly, carefully, with the quiet reverence of someone receiving more than just food. Jacob watched him, a strange emotion rising in his chest, something between pain, gratitude, and something almost sacred. It was a feeling he'd never known from people or places, a feeling of being needed, trusted, loved, even when he had nothing to offer but himself. Outside, the city was waking up. The sounds crept in, engines roaring, distant horns blaring, and hurried footsteps of early commuters. But inside that broken-down shelter, Jacob and Shadow sat pressed together like two leaves clinging to a branch after a brutal storm, still hanging on, though already torn. Jacob looked up at the roof. Tiny beams of early sunlight pierced through the holes above, drawing soft spots of light on the dusty floor. He smiled, faintly, not from joy, but from the quiet realization that maybe, just maybe, he was learning to create light even in the darkest places. "Maybe this is our attic," he whispered, "our secret little room." Shadow gave a low whimper and wagged his tail once in reply. In that space, among cold air and hunger, among crumbling walls and uncertainty about tomorrow, a stale piece of bread and a worn-out jacket became the quiet proof of the greatest friendship Jacob had ever known. And perhaps, right there in that broken-down attic of the world, a quiet dream had started to grow. A dream of a real home, one that wouldn't cast you out just because you chose to love. After a night huddled in the abandoned bus stop, wrapped in a threadbare jacket and sharing their last piece of bread, Jacob woke to the sound of car horns drifting in from the main road. Morning fog still lingered, and the cold seeped into every layer. Beside him, Shadow lay curled up tight, breathing slow and shallow from exhaustion and hunger. Jacob gently stroked his back, murmured a few quiet words of encouragement, then stood up, brushed the dust off his clothes, and slung his nearly empty backpack over one shoulder. He had no clear plan, but he knew they had to move. They had to keep going, had to find something, anything to survive, for both of them. They wandered through back alleys that led to the main streets, slipping into the crowd as the city began its daily rhythm. No one paid much attention to the two figures weaving quietly along the sidewalk. A scruffy boy in worn-out clothes and a thin dog walking close beside him, eyes flicking between cars and passers-by. When they reached a busy street market near a major intersection, Jacob stopped at the edge of the sidewalk, planning to rest for a bit and maybe ask for crumbs at a nearby bakery. He sat down beneath a tree, Shadow resting his head on Jacob's leg, both too tired to speak. And then, a scream tore through the bustle of the morning. "My child! Please! Someone help!" A woman's panicked cry erupted from across the street, stopping the crowd in its tracks. Jacob's head snapped up, eyes darting in the direction of the voice, and his heart dropped. A toddler, no more than 3, had broken free and was now tottering into the road. A massive truck was barreling toward the child, far too fast to stop in time. No one moved. Adults screamed, gasped, and raised their hands to their mouths in horror. Their legs are frozen in place. But Jacob didn't think. He just moved. "Shadow, come on!" he shouted, bolting from the curb with the speed of instinct alone. Shadow shot after him like a streak of black, both of them slicing through morning light like wind. The truck screeched, tires shrieking against the pavement in a desperate stop. The sound cut through the street like a knife. But in the single second that mattered most, Jacob reached the child, shoving him out of harm's way just in time. Shadow barked fiercely, circling the toddler's legs, nudging him even farther from danger. They all crashed to the pavement at the edge of the road, just inches from disaster. Dust rose, horns blared, people shouted in a panic. The child cried out, shaken. Jacob gasped for air, scrapes blooming on his arms and knees, his body still trembling from the moment. He knelt beside the boy, gently smoothing his hair, trying to calm him. Beside him, Shadow stood, panting hard, ears alert, still watching the truck that had finally come to a halt only a few feet away. The crowd rushed in. The mother fell to her knees, sobbing as she clutched her child, whispering thank yous through tears. But when she looked up to find the boy's rescuer, she only caught sight of a skinny kid already backing away, pulling a thin black dog with him as they disappeared into the sea of people. Jacob didn't wait for thanks. He didn't wait to be questioned. He knew too well how people reacted when they saw someone like him. Dirty, ragged, clearly homeless. Grateful one moment, suspicious the next. He didn't want attention. He didn't want praise. He just wanted to leave quietly, the same way he had arrived, with Shadow, unseen and unnamed. What Jacob didn't know was that across the street, a man had captured the entire moment on his phone. The boy dashing into the road, the dog following close behind, the toddler being pushed to safety, a forgotten kid, and a stray dog acting faster than anyone else. And that video, within hours, would go viral, spreading across the internet at lightning speed. People wouldn't know Jacob's name. They wouldn't know where he came from. But they would remember that clip, the boy with nothing, the dog once abandoned, reminding the world of something simple, that courage doesn't come from status, and love doesn't require anything but heart. But Jacob didn't know any of that yet. He just held Shadow close and whispered, "Good job, buddy. We did the right thing." And together they walked on, fading from the crowd, down streets no one ever names, like silent heroes in an ordinary world. Back under the rusted shelter of the old bus stop, where cracked bricks still held the silent footprints of 2 nobodies, Jacob sat beside Shadow, legs aching, and mind still echoing the chaos of the morning. Though he was exhausted to the point of collapse, sleep wouldn't come. Maybe the adrenaline hadn't fully worn off, or maybe for the first time in a long time, Something else had stirred inside him. A fragile belief that he could become something. Not just that poor delivery kid. Not just the orphan clinging to a shelter, but someone good, someone useful, someone worth remembering, even just once. Outside, the sun had slipped behind a row of dull gray buildings, but the last traces of twilight painted streaks of pale orange across the sky. They spilled through the holes in the corrugated metal roof, leaving patches of soft color on the floor, like watercolor stains on paper. Paper Jacob had never had enough money to buy. He looked up at the light, and, without meaning to, smiled. A rare smile, unforced and unbitter. It was the quiet pull of something buried for so long. A dream. Shadow, he said softly, voice hoarse but warm. You know, if we're still alive tomorrow, I'm going to start over. Not because someone told me to, but because I want to. He paused, glancing down at his thin, scratched-up hands, the cuts from earlier still faintly bleeding. I want to learn how to draw. Sounds ridiculous, right? A kid with no home, no money, dreaming about something as fancy as art. But I miss the feel of a pencil in my hand. I miss watching the pictures in my head come to life, line by line, color by color, like there's a cleaner, kinder world in there waiting for me to sketch it out. Shadow looked up at him, brown eyes sharp with focus, ears folding then lifting again as if truly listening. Not like a dog responding to a command, but like a friend holding on to every word. Jacob reached out and rubbed his head, his gaze softening. I dream of a small room, just a window, a desk, and a few pencils. Maybe I'd still be broke, still eating cheap noodles every day, but at least I wouldn't wake up to Miss Agnes screaming or get kicked out of bed just for sleeping in. I want a place where if I finish a drawing, I can hang it up on the wall and no one tears it down or calls it a waste of paper. He let out a breath of laughter, shaky with emotion. I know, it all sounds so far away. But now, having you with me, that's enough reason to believe maybe it's not. Shadow tucked his head into Jacob's chest, breathing slow and warm like a silent agreement. Jacob pulled him closer, arms wrapped around his thin body the way you'd hold a fragile hope, and leaned back against the cold wall, eyes drifting toward the last light slipping through the roof. A breeze blew through, carrying the scent of smoke from a faraway street, but also lifting memories of his grandmother. He could still see her smile as he scribbled on the backs of old cardboard boxes, still hear her voice like a whisper through the wind. You don't need to be the best. If you draw with your heart, every picture will have a soul. The words returned to him like an old song, out of tune but never forgotten. Jacob closed his eyes, not from tiredness, but to draw. In his mind, he saw himself sitting by a window, sunlight spilling over a blank page. Beside him, Shadow dozed peacefully, head resting on his leg. No one calls him a burden. No one is telling him to give up what he loves. Just him, a pencil, and a world slowly appearing. Gentle, quiet, and real. And as the night draped itself over the city, as the sounds of the world faded into the hush of passing wind, Jacob stayed there, holding tight to his dream. Not to escape, but to protect it, to let it grow, inch by inch, day by day. Because if life had taken so much from him already, then the least he could do was never take himself away from what mattered. After an evening beneath the glowing hues of sunset, night fell faster than Jacob had expected. He sat leaning against the wall of the abandoned bus stop, Shadow pressed close beside him, offering the only warmth left between them as the darkness thickened. Cold wind slipped through the holes in the rusted tin roof, whispering a silent warning that in this city, the night wasn't only cold because of the weather, but because of the things that lurked behind the flickering yellow streetlights. Jacob wasn't new to bad things happening after 9 p.m. He'd seen enough. People were getting their bags stolen, phones snatched, fights breaking out over nothing, but he'd never thought he'd be in the middle of one. The sounds came fast. Rushed footsteps, a hoarse voice, the unmistakable struggle of something being yanked away. They came from the alley to the right of the shelter. Jacob shot up instinctively, eyes scanning the shadows of the decaying street. Under the dim light at the end of the road, he spotted an old man grappling to keep hold of his wallet, while two masked young men tried to tear it from him. One had him in a chokehold. The other was rifling through his coat pockets, moving fast, practiced, like they'd done this 100 times before. Jacob's fists are clenched. His heart pounded. He knew what happened when people stayed silent. How easy it was to pretend you didn't see, to look away and keep walking like it wasn't your problem. But his eyes drifted, instinctively, to Shadow, who was now standing alert, fur raised, a low growl rising in his throat. Their eyes met for one brief moment, and that was enough. No words, no hesitation. Together they ran toward the cries for help, like two streaks of wind cutting through the cold night. "Hey, stop!" Jacob shouted, his voice echoing through the quiet street. The thieves spun around, startled at first, but then they laughed, seeing nothing more than a skinny kid and a stray dog sprinting toward them. "Beat it, kid!" one of them barked, lunging to punch Jacob as he neared. The blow missed, but the force knocked Jacob off balance. That was when Shadow struck. With a fierce snarl, he lunged at the second thief, sinking his teeth into the man's arm. The man screamed. The old man collapsed to the ground. The thieves staggered, shocked, and suddenly panicked. One of them tripped in the middle of the street, scrambled to his feet as Shadow growled and gave chase, then vanished into the alleys beyond. Jacob gasped for breath, dropping to his knees beside the old man. "Sir, are you okay?" he asked, voice shaking as he held the man's shoulder. The old man was trembling, his breaths short and shallow. "You saved me," he stammered, gripping Jacob's hand, eyes brimming with tears of fear and gratitude. He had thought it was the end, just another victim, another silent tragedy in a city that barely blinked. But then, from the dark, a boy and a black dog had come crashing in like something out of a dream. Jacob didn't stay to receive thanks. He turned around and called, "Shadow, come back." A few seconds later, Shadow emerged from the shadows, his muzzle still flecked with the thief's hair, eyes sharp, ears high, every muscle on alert. He returned to Jacob's side, sat down, panting hard, watching the old man with a protective stillness, as if he were a silent guardian. But from across the street, someone else was watching. A tall man stood behind the branches of a tree. He wore a dark fedora, a long coat, and his eyes were locked on Jacob. He said nothing, but the look on his face spoke volumes. This was Michael Dawson, head of one of the city's largest private security firms. He had been passing through the old district after a late meeting, looking for a cab, when he'd witnessed something that made him stop in his tracks. Michael had seen bravery before. He had worked with soldiers, officers, bodyguards, but rarely had he seen a true act of courage, and rarely from someone like that. A thin boy, in worn clothes, with no badge, no weapon, and no reason to run toward danger except the heart inside his chest, and a loyal dog by his side. He raised his phone, quietly filming as Jacob helped the old man to his feet, while Shadow kept watch beside them. And behind them, the night seemed to pull back, giving way to something brighter. Not from the streetlights, but from something far rarer. Raw, human courage. Michael pressed his lips together, deep in thought. He knew, right then and there, that this boy deserved more than gratitude. He deserved a chance. And he made a decision. Tonight, he would find out who this boy was, even if he had to search every street corner of the city. Because sometimes, the one most worth saving is the one who never thinks twice before saving someone else. After the old man had been taken inside a nearby diner to rest and call his family, Jacob turned to leave, just like he always did. He never stayed after helping someone, never waited for thanks. Gratitude was unfamiliar to him, but this time was different. A voice called out behind him, low, steady, unhurried, but with a weight that stopped Jacob's steps like an invisible hand pressing him down. "You're going to leave without letting someone say thank you?" Jacob turned, eyes wary, unsure whether he was about to be scolded for doing something out of line. But the man standing before him wasn't like anyone Jacob had ever met. He was tall, dressed in a long, dark brown overcoat. His eyes were sharp, but not cold. The way he stood, calm, hands clasped in front of him, carried the quiet composure of someone who had known power but hadn't let it kill his humanity. "My name is Michael Dawson," he said, extending a hand. His voice was firm but kind. "You just saved a man's life, Jacob. That deserves recognition." Jacob froze at the sound of his name. "You know who I am?" Michael nodded slightly, eyes glinting with admiration. "I've been watching since earlier. The moment you and your dog rushed to save that man, it was extraordinary. And not the kind of extraordinary people post online for likes. The kind that makes you reflect, makes you question yourself." Before Jacob could respond, Shadow, still standing at his side, suddenly stepped forward, but not aggressively. There was no growl, no fear, no hesitation. He simply looked at Michael with a different intensity, recognition. No barking, no leaping, just a gaze, deep and still, like meeting someone from a memory long buried. Michael narrowed his eyes, crouched down slowly, keeping his distance, and said in a voice barely above a whisper, "Hunter, is that you?" Jacob blinked. "Did you just call Shadow what?" "Hunter," Michael repeated, his voice catching with emotion. "That's his real name. He's a Malinois Shepherd mix. We raised him from a pup. He was a specially trained guard dog at our estate. No one got past the gate without his consent." He gave a soft laugh, tinged with sorrow. He wasn't just a pet, he was family. Jacob looked down at Shadow, no, Hunter, and noticed the dog didn't flinch at the name. He blinked, wagged his tail once, then stepped closer to Michael, slowly, silently, like waiting to be recognized. Michael studied the dog's left hind leg, eyes locking onto a small, crescent-shaped scar. His breath caught. "It is you." He turned to Jacob, voice rough with memory. "2 years ago, during a home invasion, Hunter fought to protect my family. One of the intruders stabbed him and dragged him into a truck. The police found blood, tire tracks, and tiny paw prints running the other way, but no trace of him after that night. We thought he was gone. My daughter cried for a month." Jacob was speechless. He reached down and gently stroked Hunter's head, and saw something in the dog's eyes he had never truly seen before. Not fear, not grief, but a calm, quiet clarity, as if Hunter had always known where he was going, and now had arrived. "I found him in an alley," Jacob said softly. "He was starving, soaked, barely able to move. I gave him the only food I had, and we've been together ever since." Michael nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the unlikely pair before him. A boy in a fraying jacket, thin but bright-eyed, and a loyal dog, equally worn by life but just as brave. He didn't see 2 vagrants. He saw 2 souls, bonded by something this modern world had almost forgotten: unconditional kindness. "Jacob," Michael said, his voice steady now, "you didn't just save a man tonight. You brought a piece of my family home, but I'm not here to take him back. Clearly, Hunter has already chosen." He looked down, and there was Hunter, now lying with his head on Jacob's foot, eyes half closed but alert, like a silent guardian who wouldn't move unless given a reason. "I owe you, both of you, far more than words can say," Michael continued. "And if you'll let me, I want to help change your life." Jacob stared at him, stunned. No one had ever said that to him before. No one had ever asked if he wanted help or if he ever dreamed of a different life. But now, in that moment, something flickered to life inside him. Not for the reward, not for the recognition, but because, for the first time, someone wasn't looking at him like a stray, but like someone who mattered. And that would be the beginning of an entirely new chapter in the journey of Jacob and Hunter. A chapter where doors began to open, where impossible things started to feel possible. A fated meeting, born in the darkest hour of night, now lit with a light strong enough to carry them forward, no longer alone and no longer in the shadows. After Michael's offer, silence fell like a curtain, thick, heavy, almost sacred. Even the wind seemed to still, as if nature itself were stepping back to give space for a decision that tightened something in the hearts of all three present. Or rather, two people and one loyal soul who had seen far too much change. Jacob said nothing. His eyes had grown hazy, not from tears, at least not yet, but from the quiet fog rising from somewhere deep inside. At his feet, Hunter, lay motionless as if he could sense something shifting, something weightier than any storm outside. Michael sighed, his gaze softening, his voice almost a murmur, like speaking to himself. "Hunter was a part of our family," he said. "My daughter spent nights crying after he vanished. My wife kept his last photo beside her bed for 2 years. We never stopped looking. I always thought that if we ever found him again, we'd bring him home. Fix what was broken." He paused. Jacob stood with his head bowed, fists clenched around the edge of his tattered coat until the knuckles turned white. "But," Michael continued, "after seeing the way he looks at you, the way he protects you without command, I started to wonder. Maybe bringing him back isn't what's right anymore." The question wasn't asked to be answered. It was a blade, quiet, sharp, and cutting straight through Jacob's chest. He had already thought it. If Michael wanted Hunter back, it would make sense. This was his dog, his family, his history. Jacob had nothing, just nights spent scraping by, a handful of old bruises, and the kind of gratitude that always seemed to come too late. Jacob lifted his head, swallowing hard against the tightness in his throat. But the tears were already there, slipping down his cheeks before he could stop them. He wasn't crying from sadness, but from helplessness, the gut-wrenching ache of knowing he was about to lose the only thing the world had ever let him truly have. "I know he's yours," Jacob said, voice trembling but holding on to the last threads of calm. "If you want to take him, I won't stop you. I won't fight." He turned away, wiped his eyes quickly with the sleeve of his coat as if trying to hide his weakness. "I just ask one thing. If you take him, please, don't leave right away. Just give me a minute. 1 minute. To hold him one last time." The words froze the air. Michael looked at the boy, this thin, quiet kid who had saved an old man's life, who had returned his long-lost dog, and realized in that moment that if anyone in the world deserved to keep Hunter, it was Jacob. But Michael didn't answer yet, because the choice wasn't his. He knelt, patted his knee, and called softly, "Hunter, come here." The voice was familiar, steady, warm, the same one that had trained Hunter in his earliest days. Hunter raised his head, his ears flicked up, muscle memory responding. He pushed himself up on his front legs, looked at Michael for a long, long moment, then turned to Jacob. His eyes flicked back and forth between the two of them. Jacob gently stroked his head, his hand shaking slightly. He said nothing. Hunter looked at both of them, the man who had raised him, his former life, his first home, and the boy who had shared half a cold burger in the rain, who had given him a new name and never asked him to be anything more than a friend. Time stretched thin. Then Hunter took one step toward Michael. Jacob's heart dropped. But then Hunter stopped, looked back, and without hesitation he turned around. He padded back to Jacob, lay down beside him, and rested his head on the boy's foot. His eyes closed, not out of exhaustion, but peace. Jacob broke, not loudly, not with sobs, but his shoulders shook with each breath. He pulled Hunter's head close, burying his face in the scruffy fur, and whispered, "You didn't have to choose me, but you did." Michael stood still. On one side of him was the past, memory, loss, a family's grief. On the other was the present, a boy who had never had anything but had given Hunter something even Michael had forgotten to offer, the freedom to choose. And in that quiet, heavy moment, Michael nodded. Not in agreement, but in reverence. A silent bow to a bond too deep to name. After Michael's heavy, wordless nod beneath the windless night sky, none of the three, Jacob, Michael, or even Hunter, said anything. Jacob kept his head bowed, arms wrapped tightly around the only companion he had ever truly had, while silent tears soaked into the warm fur weathered by wind and time. He didn't dare speak, didn't dare lift his head, didn't dare believe that what had just happened was real, that Hunter, or rather Shadow, had chosen him, not because he had anything to offer, but because their silent, unwavering bond had grown stronger than any call from the past. Michael still stood nearby, eyes locked on the dog that had once been the steadfast guardian of his family's estate. He slowly crouched again, patted his knee, and spoke, not with command, but with gentle hope and quiet sorrow. "Hunter boy, come here." Shadow lifted his head, ears flicking up at the familiar tone, his eyes wide, aware. But this time, he didn't move. He just looked, long and deep, not defiant, but understanding, as if to say, "I know you love me, but I've found where I'm meant to stay." Michael slowly lowered his hand, breathing deeply as emotion stirred behind his composed gaze. He wasn't angry. He wasn't disappointed. Just quietly undone. Perhaps even he hadn't expected the ache that filled his chest now, a strange mix of joy at seeing his old friend alive and pain from realizing that friend no longer belonged to him. Shadow turned his body, inching closer to Jacob, and sat beside him once more. His gaze remained fixed on Michael, not asking for permission nor offering apology, but as a silent thank you. Jacob, still trembling, whispered through fading tears, "Thank you for staying." His hand slid gently along Shadow's back, each movement searching for reassurance that this wasn't a dream, that in a world that had turned its back on him, one soul had chosen to stay by his side for no reason other than love. Michael watched them for a long time. He took in every detail, the rise and fall of Shadow's breathing, the flicker of his eyes, the subtle calm of a creature that had survived much, and yet now truly seemed at peace. It struck him then, something he had never quite understood until now, the light in Shadow's eyes. A light that wasn't just the reflection of a street lamp, but of a soul finally at home. Michael had made 1,000 decisions in his life. He had led teams, signed contracts worth millions, and overseen complex global security operations. And yet now, in the quiet presence of a homeless boy and a loyal dog, he felt small. Because some things, pure loyalty, unconditional love, the freedom of choosing whom to trust, were beyond wealth and power. He began, voice lower than before. "I always thought bringing him home would complete what was lost. But now I see some pieces don't fit the same picture anymore. And you, Jacob, you are the picture he chose to complete." Jacob finally looked up. His eyes still shimmered, but his gaze no longer wavered. "I don't know what to say," he replied softly. "Only that if there's anyone who could understand why Shadow won't return, I believe it's you." Michael nodded and stepped closer. He reached down and, for the first time, gently stroked Shadow's head. "Take good care of him, Jacob. He was once our family's hero, and now he's yours." Then he stood, stepped back slowly, and left the scene to the two who had somehow found each other in a world too big, too cold, too quick to forget. He said nothing more because he didn't need to. Everything that had to be said was already in Shadow's choice. The way he turned back, lay down beside Jacob, and didn't move. The look in his eyes, the unwavering loyalty. And for Michael, a father who had once lost a child, a man who had once lost a beloved dog. That was enough. Enough to let go without regret. After Shadow lay beside Jacob, an unspoken declaration of his choice, Michael didn't walk away right away. He stood in silence for several minutes, watching the two companions fate had reunited in the most unlikely way. In that moment, the question of whether to keep or let go of his once-beloved dog faded into something greater. The realization of what truly mattered after everything he had lost. Not reclaiming the past, but lifting someone into the future. He took a deep breath and stepped closer to the boy, who still had his head buried against the loyal creature by his side. His voice, when it came, no longer belonged to a man trying to reclaim a dog, but to someone who saw, at last, a life in need of a new beginning. "Jacob," he said low and steady, "I know you don't need pity. You're strong. And Hunter didn't choose you because you're weak. He chose you because you're not. But even the strongest person can't live without a home." Jacob slowly lifted his head. His eyes were still red, lips pressed tightly against emotion. But he listened. Truly listened. Michael stopped just a step away and gently placed a hand on Jacob's shoulder. It wasn't forceful. It wasn't pitying. It was just human. "You don't have to keep living under rusted rooftops and eating what little scraps you can find," he said. "I have a house, not a mansion, but big enough for one more. And if you're willing, I'd like you to live there, with me." The air seemed to still, caught in a strange quiet. Only Shadow's slow breathing and the hush of wind sweeping past old street signs remained. Jacob didn't speak. He couldn't. Not because he didn't want to, but because no one had ever asked him a question like that. He had spent his life being left behind, being labeled, orphan, troublemaker, waste. No one had ever looked at him the way Michael did now. Not with pity, not with judgment, but with respect, with belief, with recognition. Michael's voice remained calm, but firm, carrying the weight of someone who had known loss and refused to let it repeat. "I'm not here to change you, or to make you feel like you owe me. I'm here because I believe kindness should be passed on. Hunter brought you into my life, and I won't ignore that. If you agree, I'll give you a safe home. A real room. A desk with warm light. A drawer filled with colored pencils. And most importantly, an education. A chance to go to school like any other kid. No one will push you away. No one will ask your dog to leave. There will be space for both of you." Jacob hugged Shadow closer. His eyes brimmed again, but this time not from sorrow. These were tears of something he couldn't name. "I've never had a home," he whispered, voice fragile as the wind. "And I never thought anyone would want me to stay." Michael smiled gently and knelt so that their eyes were level. "Then let me invite you into that dream. Not as someone being rescued, but as part of a family." He extended his hand, open, waiting. No pressure, no expectations, just an offering. Jacob stared at that hand for a long time. It was strong, weathered, capable, but in this moment it was soft, welcoming. And finally, slowly but without hesitation, he placed his hand into it. The grip wasn't tight, but in Jacob's chest, his heart surged as though it had finally remembered how to beat. Shadow wagged his tail, stepped forward to sniff Michael again, then gently rested his head against Jacob's leg, as if giving his full blessing. Together, the three of them stood and stepped out of that damp corner of the city, not away from something, but toward something entirely new. Jacob's shoulders still shook, but not from fear, from knowing that he was crossing into a different chapter of his life. On the drive to their new home, Michael told Jacob about his daughter, the one who had drawn an entire comic book about Hunter. He told him about the guest room, now empty and waiting, and about an old friend who taught art and had agreed to take on a new student if the boy was truly serious. Jacob said nothing at first. He sat quietly, glancing at Shadow now and then, fingers tugging at the collar of his worn-out hoodie, lips pressed as if trying to hold in every emotion rising. But then, as the car turned down a stone-paved street lined with whispering trees, he finally spoke. "Thank you," he said softly, "for believing in me." Michael said nothing. He just smiled, because he knew. This boy had just taken his first steps, not just into a new house, but into the life he had always deserved. And in the end, the greatest gift wasn't a room, or a desk, or a second chance. It wasn't charity, it was faith, passed from one human to another, to start again. From the moment Jacob took Michael Dawson's outstretched hand beneath the flickering street lamp of a forgotten city block, a new chapter in his life began. He now lived in a warm house, where even the blankets smelled gently of lavender, where birdsong greeted each morning and sunlight truly reached through the windows, not the rusty cracks of a bus shelter. but a real home. With Shadow beside him, Jacob began adjusting to a new rhythm. Scheduled classes, time for sketching, people who noticed when he was too quiet, and real encouragement even when his pencil lines still trembled. It felt like a dream, one he'd never dared to name aloud. But as that dream spread, it inevitably brushed against those who'd never wanted it to come true. Across town, back in the greasy corners of the fast food joint where Jacob had once delivered meals through winter rain, Kyle, his older, bitter former co-worker, stumbled across a viral post. A short video clip showed Jacob rushing into traffic to save an old man from a robbery. Shadow was in the frame, and in the background, Michael Dawson stepping into view. The caption read, "Homeless teen saves elderly man. Taken in by security firm CEO." The blood in Kyle's face drained, then surged. Bitterness, resentment, envy. It churned inside him like thick, black tar. Kyle had always sneered at Jacob's quiet kindness, hated how customers liked him, hated that a skinny, soft-spoken kid could somehow threaten his fragile place in the world. But this question mark, a nobody orphan, now living in a mansion while Kyle still delivered cold chicken to angry strangers? He's not some hero. Kyle spat aloud, crumpling a napkin in his fist. Fury, twisting his features, pulled out his phone, logged into an old anonymous social media account. His fingers hovered over the screen. A plan formed. Not violent, not loud. Just be precise. He dug up an old photo. Jacob sitting next to a trash bin after a shift, talking to Shadow, unaware of the camera. He paired it with a mocking caption. The real hero, or just the best actor in the game? Then came the forged messages. A fake chat between Jacob and a made-up friend, edited carefully to sound just real enough. Pretending to be homeless was the smartest move I ever made. They bought it. A new life, just like that. Laced with sarcasm, dressed as insider truth, the post spread quickly across a niche forum where suspicion festered, and kindness was always questioned. Kyle followed up with burner accounts, fanning the flames. I used to work with that kid, quiet type, but always sneaking food when no one was looking. Don't believe everything you see. People fake sob stories all the time. In a matter of days, the whispers grew. Threads popped up on obscure platforms linking Jacob's name with words like manipulator and emotional con artist. There was no real evidence, just edited screenshots and a tone that made people doubt. And the most dangerous thing about doubt? Once it's planted, people dig. Until even beauty starts to look like a lie. Michael Dawson received his first anonymous email a few mornings later. No subject, just an attachment and a line of text. Mr. Dawson, perhaps you should reconsider who you've welcomed into your home. Are you certain this boy isn't playing you? Michael read it in silence. His expression didn't change, but his fingers gripped the phone until his knuckles went white. He knew this world well, knew it didn't easily forgive the poor for climbing too high, too fast. Not because they did wrong, but because they dared to escape the role society had assigned to them. And Michael also knew this was only the beginning of a storm Jacob had never been taught to weather. But one thing was certain. He would not let the boy face it alone. Not this time. Not ever again. The anonymous messages kept coming, like drops of poison deliberately seeping into the peaceful lake that Jacob and Michael had just begun to build. The atmosphere in the house suddenly grew heavy, weighed down by something unspoken. Michael, a cautious man who prided himself on his ability to read people, maintained his usual composed exterior. But inside, doubt had begun to take root. Not because he fully believed the baseless accusations, but because his concern for Jacob made him afraid. What if it was all a lie? What if Shadow, had been used in a carefully staged performance to win sympathy? Had he been nurturing a deception rather than a life? That evening, when Jacob returned from his art class, his hair still streaked with paint, his sleeves dusted with charcoal, he didn't immediately notice the change in the air. Michael was sitting in his study, his phone face down on the desk, a stack of printed emails and photographs in his hand. When Jacob stepped in, offering a small smile, and about to ask about dinner, Michael simply looked up. His eyes no longer held the usual warmth. Instead, they were deep, slow, and filled with scrutiny. "Jacob," he said, his voice unnervingly calm, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest." Jacob froze, his grip on his backpack tightening slightly. Yes?" Michael hesitated for a moment, then placed the papers in front of him. "Your old friends claim that everything you did, from saving Hunter to coincidentally meeting me, was planned. That you once said you'd pretend to be poor to get the attention of the wealthy. That you knew who I was all along. Is it true?" At that moment, Jacob's world shattered into 1,000 pieces. He stared at Michael, at the papers before him, his legs suddenly feeling weak. His lips trembled, his eyes widening, not in anger but in disbelief. The only person who had ever reached out to him, the only person he had ever trusted, was doubting him. "You believe that?" His voice was small, but it carried the weight of a lifetime of buried pain. Michael didn't answer right away. He turned his gaze away, as if he couldn't bear to meet Jacob's eyes. "I don't know what to think, Jacob. It's just these testimonies, the words of those who used to work with you." Jacob bit down on his lip so hard it bled. "Kyle," he whispered, then spoke louder, voice shaking. "He's hated me for so long. He's called me a leech, a stray dog among strays. I have never lied to you, never I." But Michael remained silent. Being doubted by the person he trusted most was a pain worse than all the nights he had spent sleeping on the streets combined. Jacob turned away, not wanting Michael to see the tears silently streaming down his face. He strode toward the door, leaving behind only one broken sentence, carried away by the wind. "If you think I'm a liar too, then maybe I don't belong here." The door closed with a soft yet chilling finality. Shadow, who had been lying by the porch, immediately sprang up when Jacob ran past. It let out a low growl and started to follow, but Jacob simply placed a hand on its head, stroking it gently, briefly. "You have to stay," he whispered. "You need a safe place. I don't have one anymore." And then he walked away, his small figure fading into the long, endless road, never once looking back. That night, Shadow refused to eat, refused to sleep in the warmth of the house. It sat in front of the door, ears drooped, eyes fixed on the path where Jacob had disappeared. Even when Michael called for it in his weary, hoarse voice, even when food was placed right before its nose, it remained still, breathing softly, sighing like a grieving human. All night, it didn't move. By morning, it was still there, gaunt, silent, unmoving, just like the boy it had chosen to follow. Michael watched it all. He sat in the living room, his coffee untouched, his eyes never leaving Shadow, the creature that was now starving itself over the boy he had just cast out. A quiet thought gnawed at him. If Jacob was truly just a fraud, then would a dog-like Hunter, trained since birth to protect only the good, be this loyal? Would it refuse to return to its old master? Would it starve itself for the absence of a stranger? And for the first time in years, after a life dictated by contracts and logic, Michael began to doubt himself. The next morning, as the first light of dawn filtered through the window and stretched across the wooden floor where Shadow still lay unmoving, like a breathing statue, Michael stepped out of his study. In his hand was a printed transcript of a recovered conversation, traced back to an IP address near a public internet cafe not far from Kyle's old neighborhood. The fake messages, the lies, none of it came from Jacob. The proof was clear. The truth hit like a blade, cutting through the fog of doubt that had hung over him for days, and with it came the weight of shame, a sharp, suffocating guilt. Michael had let a flicker of suspicion drive away a boy who had already lost everything, a boy who had trusted him. He knelt beside Shadow, meaning to offer a quiet apology through touch. But the dog suddenly stirred, ears twitching as if catching something distant in the air. Shadow didn't bark. He didn't growl. He simply turned to look at Michael with eyes burning with urgency, then bolted toward the door. Michael blinked. Before he could speak, Shadow stopped, tugged lightly at his pant leg with his mouth, then trotted toward the gate. He looked back. His eyes were unmistakable. "Follow me." Without a second thought, Michael grabbed his keys, opened the gate, and followed. They moved quickly through the streets, past the familiar alleys Jacob used to take on his way to school, past the old bus stop where Jacob and Shadow had spent their first night together. And then they arrived. A forgotten warehouse by the river, long abandoned, damp and silent. Shadow slowed, growled low in his throat, then moved inward, his steps purposeful, certain, as if he already knew what waited inside. Tucked away in a corner of the warehouse, behind a pile of discarded boxes, Jacob lay curled beneath a worn jacket. His body was still, shivering from the cold. He wasn't asleep. His eyes were open, dull, fixed on the stained ceiling above. There was no spark left in them. Nothing but quiet disbelief in anything good that might still exist in the world. Until he heard it. The sound of familiar paws across concrete, the ragged breath, the soft scratch of nails against the floor. He turned his head just as Shadow rushed in, burying his face into Jacob's chest, whimpering like a child who had finally found their way home from a long, dark dream. "Shadow," Jacob whispered, his voice hoarse and dry, his arms wrapped tightly around the warm, trembling body. Tears spilled down his face, soaking into Shadow's fur as he pressed his face into it, hiding from the storm that had just broken open inside him. Behind them, Michael entered the warehouse. He stopped a few steps away, taking in the sight before him. Boy and dog, wrapped in wordless devotion, the bond too sacred to interrupt. Then he spoke, his voice soft, low, and unlike anything he'd said in years. "Jacob, I'm sorry." There was no response at first. Jacob stayed buried in Shadow's fur, his hands shaking. Michael stepped forward, his voice growing rough with emotion. "I was wrong to doubt you. Wrong to let a single moment of hesitation destroy the trust you placed in me. I checked everything. Kyle was behind it. All of it. The lies, the screenshots, the fake messages. I know now. I know the truth." He paused, then added, almost a whisper, "I know it might be too late, but if there's even a shred of trust left, let me make this right." Jacob slowly raised his head. His eyes were red, not angry, but hurt, deeply hurt. "You were the only person I thought would never doubt me," he murmured, and just one lie and it all crumbled. Michael dropped to his knees, no hesitation, no pride, and looked Jacob in the eye. "I don't deserve forgiveness, not yet, but if you'll let me, I'll earn it. Day by day, however long it takes." His voice didn't shake out of fear. It was the steady voice of someone who had finally understood the cost of failing someone who needed him the most. Jacob looked at Michael for a long moment, then lowered his gaze and gently stroked Shadow's head, who was now lying quietly beside him. And then he gave a small nod. It wasn't immediate forgiveness, but it was a spark of hope. And for the three of them, perhaps that was enough to begin again. This time, with truth and love forged through pain. A man who once doubted, a boy who had been abandoned, and a loyal dog, within the cold stillness of an empty warehouse, had found their way back to each other. Not because of fate, but because trust had finally returned to where it truly belonged. When Jacob left that cold, abandoned warehouse with Michael and Shadow, he had no idea what lay ahead. But for the first time, he wasn't afraid. Not because the pain had vanished, but because this time, returning didn't feel like surrender. It felt like coming home. Michael hadn't just apologized with words. He had acted. He brought Jacob back not through the back gate like a temporary guest, but through the front door, like a rightful member of the family. And just as he had promised that morning in the cold wind, everything Jacob had once gone without, everything he had only dared to dream through scribbled sketches and sidewalk sleep, slowly became real. He was enrolled in a small private school with an art program tailored for students from difficult backgrounds. In the beginning, Jacob remained quiet, eyes lowered whenever someone tried to talk to him. But little by little, the brushes, the paint sets, and the presence of new friends, kids who also carried their scars, helped him open up. He began to draw again. No longer crude sketches on scraps of paper, but full paintings filled with depth, light, and raw emotion. He painted his first room with a window. He painted shadow under the tree in front of the house. He painted Michael standing in the kitchen, slightly hunched, setting down a warm bowl of soup with a gentle smile. Shadow was always by his side, a loyal shadow in every sense. Whether at school or home, in the art room or on the playground, all Jacob had to do was look back. And there were those familiar eyes, eyes that had wandered with him through so many cold nights, now still refusing to leave. Shadow learned to wait outside the gate while Jacob was in class, and when the bell rang, he was the first to race up to Jacob, tail wagging wildly like it had been years since their last reunion. Through all the changes, their bond remained untouched. Michael, once a savior, then a source of heartbreak, had become Jacob's truest anchor. He didn't just provide meals or school supplies. He quietly watched over Jacob each evening, making sure the boy knew he was loved, that he no longer needed to hide his tears or pretend to be strong. Michael helped Jacob register for a new ID, took him to buy his first coat, the one he picked because he liked it, not because it was the only one left. He spoke to Jacob's teachers, took him to art exhibits, and even bought him a leather notebook to hold every creative spark. Then, one quiet weekend afternoon, as Jacob and Shadow lay reading under the backyard tree, Michael sat beside them on the bench. He pulled a small envelope from his coat, opened it, and handed Jacob a single sheet of paper. Jacob unfolded it. The first line hit him like a wave. "Application for legal adoption." He froze. His fingers tightened around the paper, eyes stung with tears. Michael just smiled, soft and steady. The same warm look Jacob had slowly grown used to, but this time it held something deeper. "If you agree," Michael said gently, "your name won't just be Jacob Parker anymore. You'll be Jacob Dawson, my son, legally and truly." No one said anything for a moment. Only the soft rustle of leaves above them and the quiet breath of Shadow curled against Jacob's feet were waiting, almost as if he too was listening for the answer. Then, in that quiet filled with emotion, Jacob nodded. No words, just a quiet, firm nod. A single tear rolled down and fell on the paper, soaking into the spot where his name was written, as if to seal the end of all the years he'd been forgotten and mark the beginning of a journey toward something real. The house that had once echoed with silence now held laughter, barks, the scratch of pencils on paper, and walls lined with artwork. Paintings filled every hallway, each one sharing the same themes: light, hope, and a dog standing loyally beside a small boy, as if to tell the world, love is never forgotten. Since the day Jacob officially became Jacob Dawson, a name no longer just a label, but living proof of a journey through pain toward belonging, time passed gently, quietly, as if life had finally stopped testing the boy who once curled up beneath the rain at a broken-down bus stop. No more long nights on cold concrete. No more suspicious glances or bitter words thrown carelessly in his path. Now Jacob lived in a house with a warm kitchen, walls lined with artwork, Michael reading the paper each morning, and Shadow resting faithfully at his feet like a friend who had never taken a single step away. That afternoon, when the wind seemed to fall still to make room for the amber glow of the sunset sinking over gray-tiled rooftops, Jacob sat on the front porch steps, a sketchbook resting in his arms, pencil rolling loosely beside him. Beside him lay Shadow, now healthy, fur fuller and brighter, yet his eyes unchanged, deep, steady, and filled with unwavering loyalty. Jacob reached into his pocket and pulled out a small loaf of bread, the same kind he used to love when he lived on the streets, not for its taste, but for the way its warmth filled the hollow spaces in his heart. He broke it in half, and without a word, handed one piece down to Shadow. The dog didn't lunge at it like he once had in that rain-soaked alley. Instead, he took it gently, looked up at Jacob, his eyes expressing a kind of love that language could never hold. Jacob smiled, and this time, the smile wasn't forced like it had been when Michael first took him in. It wasn't cautious or hesitant like the ones he used to wear in the back of the art classroom. It was real, the smile of someone who knew they were finally in the right place, with the right people, living the right life. A breeze whispered by, running through Jacob's hair, past Shadow's perked ears, and over the pages of sun-drenched sketches. Drawings of two friends sitting side by side in a peaceful world. Jacob tilted his head back and looked up at the sky, now painted in soft orange, and murmured, maybe to Shadow, maybe to himself, "We've come a long way, haven't we, Shadow?" The dog responded with a quiet exhale, nuzzling Jacob's hand, then resting his head again, eyes closed, safe, as though all the storms in the world had finally passed them by. And in that moment, everything seemed to condense into a single, unspoken truth, a message not just for Jacob, but for anyone who's ever chosen kindness in silence. Goodness is never wasted. It always finds its way back, in the most unexpected of ways. This story doesn't end with applause or miracles. It ends with a quiet breeze, half a loaf of bread, a boy once invisible who's now truly seen, and a dog who never forgot where his heart belonged. And that, perhaps, is the most beautiful ending of all. Jacob and Shadow's story is more than just a journey through hardship. It's proof of the quiet strength of kindness and unconditional friendship. From a shared loaf of bread on a rainy night, they found not only a home, but a family, and a future that once felt impossible. If you ever meet someone, or some creature in need, would you be willing to share even the smallest thing you have, like Jacob once did? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like the video, share it with someone you love, and subscribe to the channel for more stories that just might change the way you see the world. Because sometimes a single small act can change an entire life.